Dad, you're 72. You're too old to run this company.
Is that what you believe? Is that what you believe?
I already have the votes. Today, you step aside.
You sound very certain.
Because I am. What's in that folder? Something you should have read before you called this meeting. Dad, don't play games with me. I'm the CEO now. That chair is mine.
You're sitting in my chair, Daniel. That doesn't make it yours.
Mr. Hayes, before we vote, there's something you need to see.
This can wait.
No, Daniel. It can't.
Dad, what exactly did you find? You wanted a vote. So did I.
What are you saying? Open the folder. Then
My wife Linda had just given birth to Daniel a few years earlier, and money was tight. I borrowed against our house. I sold my second car. I worked nights. There were years when I didn't take a real vacation. There were Christmas mornings when I was thinking about invoices instead of presents. Linda never complained. She would simply put coffee beside me and say, "You'll get there." And eventually I did. The first warehouse was tiny. Then we bought another. Then another. Our first major contract changed everything. After that came employees, managers, regional offices, and a national client list. By the time Daniel graduated from college, Hayes Industrial was a serious company, and Daniel wanted in. I told him he could start anywhere he wanted. He chose the warehouse. I respected that. He worked 12-hour shifts. He learned inventory, sales, and purchasing. For years I was proud of him. When I eventually made him CEO, I thought I was giving my son the greatest gift I could give him. I was wrong. I wasn't giving him a gift. I was giving him responsibility, and he slowly started confusing the two. The first warning came over dinner. Daniel sat across from me with his laptop open. He said, "Dad, we need to talk about your role." I laughed. "My role?" He nodded. "You need to step back." I put down my fork. "From what?" "From the company." I stared at him. "I founded the company." "I know. I've been running it for 37 years. "I know that too." "Then what exactly are we talking about?" Daniel closed the laptop. "Dad, you're 72. I waited. He continued. "People don't say it to your face, but they're worried." "Who?" He didn't answer. "Which people?" He sighed. "Executives, investors, some of the board." That was the first lie. I knew because I had spoken to those people. Nobody had asked me to retire. Nobody had told me I was incapable. Daniel had, and he had hidden behind imaginary concern because it sounded kinder than what he really wanted. He wanted my chair. I told him I wasn't ready. He smiled. "That's exactly the problem." I didn't understand what he meant then. I do now. He wasn't asking whether I was ready to retire. He was asking whether I was ready to surrender, and I wasn't. Not yet. If Daniel had stopped there, perhaps everything would have been different. But he made one mistake. He became impatient, and impatient people reveal themselves. Within 3 weeks, I noticed unusual changes in our financial reports. 3 contracts had moved. Not cancelled, moved. They were being routed through a company called Dane Holdings. I'd never approved Dane Holdings. I'd never heard of them. And when I asked Daniel about it, he gave me an answer that sounded perfectly reasonable. At first, there are moments in business when a number looks ordinary until you know where to look. My son thought he was about to fire me. He had the resignation letter on the... He would stand beside me with a pencil behind his ear and pretend he was the boss. I'd laugh and tell him, "One day, son." He would look up at me and say, "No, Dad, not one day. I'm going to run it when I'm 25. I loved that confidence. I loved watching him dream. Back then I never imagined that one day the same boy would look at me across a boardroom table and tell me I was too old to belong there. I started Hayes Industrial in 1989. I was 35. My wife Linda had just given birth to Daniel a few years earlier, and money was tight. I borrowed against our house. I sold my second car. I worked nights. There were years when I didn't take a real vacation. There were Christmas mornings when I was thinking about invoices instead of presents. Linda never complained. She would simply put coffee beside me and say, "You'll get there." And eventually I did. The first warehouse was tiny. Then we bought another. Then another. Our first major contract changed everything. After that came employees, managers, regional offices, and a national client list. By the time Daniel graduated from college, Hayes Industrial was a serious company, and Daniel wanted in. I told him he could start anywhere he wanted. He chose the warehouse. I respected that. He worked 12-hour shifts. He learned inventory, sales, and purchasing. For years I was proud of him. When I eventually made him CEO, I thought I was giving my son the greatest gift I could give him. I was wrong. I wasn't giving him a gift. I was giving him responsibility, and he slowly started confusing the two. The first warning came over dinner. Daniel sat across from me with his laptop open. He said, "Dad, we need to talk about your role." I laughed. "My role?" He nodded. "You need to step back." I put down my fork. "From what?" "From the company." I stared at him. "I founded the company." "I know. I've been running it for 37 years. "I know that too." "Then what exactly are we talking about?" Daniel closed the laptop. "Dad, you're 72. I waited. He continued. "People don't say it to your face, but they're worried." "Who?" He didn't answer. "Which people?" He sighed. "Executives, investors, some of the board." That was the first lie. I knew because I had spoken to those people. Nobody had asked me to retire. Nobody had told me I was incapable. Daniel had, and he had hidden behind imaginary concern because it sounded kinder than what he really wanted. He wanted my chair. I told him I wasn't ready. He smiled. "That's exactly the problem." I didn't understand what he meant then. I do now. He wasn't asking whether I was ready to retire. He was asking whether I was ready to surrender, and I wasn't. Not yet. If Daniel had stopped there, perhaps everything would have been different. But he made one mistake. He became impatient, and impatient people reveal themselves. Within 3 weeks, I noticed unusual changes in our financial reports. 3 contracts had moved. Not cancelled, moved. They were being routed through a company called Dane Holdings. I'd never approved Dane Holdings. I'd never heard of them. And when I asked Daniel about it, he gave me an answer that sounded perfectly reasonable. At first, there are moments in business when a number looks ordinary until you know where to look. A table. He had already counted the votes. And in front of the entire board, he looked at his 72-year-old father and said, "Dad, you're too old to run this company." What he didn't know was that I had already discovered his secret. I didn't confront him. I didn't warn him. And I certainly didn't tell him what I had found. I let him walk straight into the trap he had built for me. And what happened next made the entire boardroom go silent, because my son thought the meeting was about removing an old man. It wasn't. It was about something much bigger, something involving company money, something he had been hiding for months, and something buried inside a document he never bothered to read. But here's the part I want you to remember. The moment my son finally realized he had lost, he didn't look at the board. He looked at me, and he said 4 words I never expected to hear from him. "Dad, please don't." I had waited 37 years to hear fear in my son's voice, but I still hadn't shown him the most important document. That document would determine whether he kept his job, his reputation, and the future he thought was already guaranteed. So how did a son confident enough to remove his own father end up begging him for mercy? And what was inside that final document? Welcome to Vengeful Patriarch, where family betrayal meets consequences, and where the person everyone underestimates is often the person who has been paying attention the longest. If you enjoy stories about fathers who refuse to surrender their dignity, family members who discover too late that money and power have limits, and endings where every secret eventually has to answer for itself, subscribe to Vengeful Patriarch. You don't need to subscribe because I asked. Subscribe because I want you here when the next story begins. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm 72 years old. For 37 years, I built Hayes. Industrial from a rented warehouse into a company worth more money than I ever imagined. I thought my son would one day carry that legacy forward. Instead, he tried to erase me from it. And the reason he did it is something I didn't understand until it was almost too late. Stay with me, because we're going back to the beginning, to the little boy who once stood beside my first warehouse and told me he was going to run my company one day. I believed him. I just never imagined he would eventually try to take my chair before he was ready to deserve it. And before this story is over, you'll understand why I didn't fire my son because I stopped loving him. I fired him because I finally understood what love without boundaries had allowed him to become. When Daniel was 8 years old, he used to follow me around the warehouse. He was fascinated by everything: The forklifts, loading docks, giant shelves stacked with equipment. That afternoon, I wasn't looking for proof that my son had betrayed me. I was looking for a reason not to believe it. That distinction matters. A father doesn't look at his own son's company records the way an auditor does. An auditor sees transactions. A father sees years. He sees the boy who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat while you drove him home from school. He sees the teenager who asked to work his first summer shift. He sees the young man who stood beside you at the warehouse and promised he would never let the company down. So every strange number has another explanation. At least, that's what I wanted to believe, but the more I looked, the harder it became to explain the pattern. And the pattern led me to 3 folders that I would eventually carry into the boardroom. At the time, I didn't know that the 3rd folder would be the one my son feared most. I called Daniel into my office. "What is Dane Holdings?" He didn't even look up from his phone. "A vendor. What do they provide? Consulting. What kind? Strategic procurement." I stared at him. "Since when do we use outside procurement consultants?" "Since we've grown." "Who approved them?" He finally looked up. "I did. Without the board," he shrugged. "I have authority." That answer bothered me, not because he was technically wrong. As CEO, Daniel did have authority over many operational decisions, but there were limits, and he knew those limits. I asked for the contract. He said he'd send it. He didn't. I asked again. He became irritated. "Dad, I have a company to run." I said, "So do I." He laughed. "No. That's the problem. That sentence stayed with me." I began reviewing everything. Dane Holdings had been paid in small increments. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would immediately trigger an alarm. But when you have spent 37 years studying your own company's numbers, patterns become obvious. The money was moving, and the contracts were moving with it. I called Margaret Collins. Margaret had been our attorney for 26 years. I asked her to review the company records. She asked why. I said, "Because I think someone is moving money." She didn't ask another question. 2 days later, she called me. "Robert." I knew from her voice that it wasn't good. "What did you find? I need you to come to my office. Tell me." "I'd rather show you." I drove there that afternoon. Margaret put 3 folders on the table. The first contained contracts. The second contained payments. The third contained ownership records. She pointed to Dane Holdings. Then she pointed to another company. Then another. And finally she said, "They all connect." "To Daniel?" She nodded. "Not directly." "Of course." His face tightened. Then he said it. "You're 72. I didn't respond. He continued, "You don't understand where this industry is going. I understand our customers. You don't understand the technology. I understand the business. You don't understand modern leadership." I looked around the room. "Do you?" He stood. Vengeful Patriarch, page 10. "I'm the CEO." And then he said the sentence that changed everything. "Dad, you're too old to run this company." Silence, complete silence. I looked at my son. I saw anger, but underneath it I saw fear. That was interesting. Because people who are certain of their power don't usually look afraid. I picked up the resignation letter. Daniel smiled. He thought I was surrendering. I asked one question. "Daniel, are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" "Yes. Even if you don't know everything that's in front of you." His expression changed. "What does that mean?" I smiled. "Nothing." I put the folder down. "I need until tomorrow." He agreed. I walked out, and the moment the elevator doors closed, I called Margaret. "It's time." She knew exactly what I meant. Vengeful Patriarch, page 11, chapter 4. The agreement. The rule Daniel never thought he would need. The most dangerous document in a family business is often the one nobody reads, because everyone assumes the family will always get along. For 20 years, Daniel had treated the shareholder agreement as paperwork. I treated it as a promise. The promise was simple. No matter who managed the company itself had to be protected. Meant the rules could not change because my son was angry. They could not change because I was his father. And they could not change because either of us believed we deserved more. That was why the next conversation mattered so much. I wasn't preparing to attack Daniel. I was giving him one final opportunity to tell me the truth. If he took it, the story could have ended very differently. He didn't. 20 years earlier, when Daniel was still learning the business, I had created a shareholder agreement. At the time, I never imagined I'd use it against him. The agreement was designed to protect the company, not me, not Daniel the company. It separated management authority from controlling ownership. Daniel could run the company, he could hire, he could negotiate, he could make operational decisions, but the controlling voting shares remained with me. That wasn't a secret. It was in the documents. Daniel simply hadn't cared about the documents because he assumed I would eventually hand him everything. And for a long time I intended to. But there was another clause, a clause I had added after watching another family business collapse. The controlling shareholder could remove a CEO for specific forms of misconduct. Financial conflicts of interest were one of them. At the time it had seemed like good governance. Now it looked like protection. Margaret told me, "You don't have to do anything dramatic." I asked, "But close enough. A friend, a former business associate, a minority ownership interest, several shell entities, enough to make me uncomfortable." I asked, "Are you saying my son is stealing from the company?" "No." She paused. "I'm saying you need to stop assuming his intentions are innocent." That hurt more. Because I wanted her to tell me I was wrong. I wanted a simple explanation. I wanted to call Daniel and apologize for doubting him. Instead, I drove home with 3 folders on the passenger seat and one thought in my mind. What else has my son been hiding? Before I continue, picture that room. 8 people around a polished table, people who had worked with me for years, people who knew the difference between a difficult decision and a dangerous one. And at the head of that table sat my son, not beside me, in my chair. That detail may sound small. It wasn't, because Daniel wasn't merely presenting a retirement plan. He was showing me, and everyone else in the room, what he believed the future looked like, a future without me. The resignation letter was only the first piece. The vote was next, and Daniel believed he had already won it. What he didn't know was that I had spent the previous evening with Margaret reviewing a document he had forgotten existed. 3 weeks later, Daniel called an emergency board meeting. He told me it was about succession planning. I almost smiled. Succession planning was something I had wanted to discuss for years. But I wanted to discuss it with Daniel. He wanted to decide it without me. When I walked into the boardroom, everyone was already seated. Daniel was at the head of the table. That was unusual. He normally sat to my right. That morning he had taken my old seat. I noticed. He noticed that I noticed. Neither of us said anything. I sat down. Daniel cleared his throat. "We need to have a difficult conversation." I said, "Go ahead." He looked at the board, then at me. "Dad, you've refused every request to transition into retirement." "I've refused because I'm not retiring." He nodded. "And that's why we're here." He pushed a folder toward me. I opened it. My resignation, already prepared, already printed, already waiting. I looked at him. "You prepared this without me," he said. "I've been trying to prepare you for months." "No." I closed the folder. "You've been preparing everyone else." The CFO looked uncomfortable. One director stared at the table. Daniel leaned forward. "Dad, this company needs to move forward. It has been moving forward, not fast enough. According to whom?" "According to me." I almost laughed. "Vengeful Patriarch, page 14. It's the company you manage." He stood. "You have no idea what I've done for this business." I said, "I know exactly what you've done." He slammed his hand on the table. "You had everything handed to you." That sentence surprised me. I said, "Handed to me?" "Yes." I stared at him. "I started with 1 truck." He said nothing. "I borrowed money to buy that truck." "Nothing. I worked nights." Silence. "I missed birthdays." His face softened for half a second, then hardened again. "You built it for us." "Yes, and now you're keeping it from me." I looked at him. "No, Daniel." I paused. "I'm trying to keep you from destroying it." Vengeful Patriarch, page 15. He shook his head. "You don't trust me." I said, "I did." He walked out. That was the last time I tried to save the relationship before saving the company. Chapter 6. The Vote Retention Bridge. The vote was not the real reveal. Daniel smiled when the vote started going his way. I remember that smile because it looked almost like the smile he had when he was 8 years old. and pretending to run my warehouse. For 1 second I saw the child again. I remembered the folder on the table. The smile disappeared from my memory, because the vote wasn't the end. It wasn't even the real test. The real test was whether Daniel understood the difference between being popular in a room and having legal authority in that room. He was about to learn it in front of everyone. And when Margaret stood up, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply placed one document on the table. Daniel looked at it. He stopped smiling. The second board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning. Daniel arrived early. He had counted the votes. I could tell he was relaxed, confident, almost cheerful. He believed he had already won. The board gathered. Daniel opened the meeting. "Today we're going to finalize the transition." I said nothing. He presented slides, growth projections, expansion plans, cost savings. Everything looked impressive. He started talking about my age. He didn't say I was incompetent. He was smarter than that. He said, "My father has served this company honorably, but leadership requires adaptation." That was the polished version. "What would you do?" she said. "Let him explain himself." That was exactly what I did. The next morning, Daniel came into my office. "Did you sign?" "No." "Dad, sit down." He stayed standing. "I don't have time." "You found time yesterday." He looked angry. "You're making this difficult." I said, "What exactly do you want?" "I want to move the company forward, and I'm stopping you." "Yes. How?" "You question every decision. That's my job." "No." He stepped closer. "That's your problem." I looked at him. "What problem?" "You can't let go." I said, "Maybe." He turned toward the door, then stopped. "You're not the company anymore." I answered, "CEO doesn't mean owner." He looked back, and for the first time he smiled. "You're going to find out." Then he left. I knew then that he had no idea what was coming. There was one question I didn't ask him about the money. I asked him something much simpler. "Daniel, do you still want to be my son, or do you only want to be the man who owns what I built?" He stared at me for a long time. He didn't answer, and sometimes silence tells you more than an admission. That was the moment I understood the real problem wasn't Dane Holdings. Dane Holdings was only the symptom. The real problem was that Daniel had begun measuring his worth by what he could take from me. The company, the title, the chair, the authority. He had forgotten the hardest part of inheritance. You inherit responsibility before you inherit privilege. That afternoon I asked Daniel to meet me privately. No board, no lawyers, just us. I put the Dane Holdings records on the table. He looked at them. His expression changed. I asked, "What's this?" "A vendor." "Why are company contracts going through a company connected to you?" He didn't answer. "Daniel," he said, "you're spying on me now. I'm protecting the company. It's my company." "No." He stared at me. I continued. The truth was simpler. He wanted my chair. Then came the vote. One director voted yes, another. Daniel looked at me. He smiled. And that's when Margaret stood. "I need to interrupt." Daniel frowned. "This isn't on the agenda." "It is now." She placed the shareholder agreement on the table. Daniel stared at it. "What is that?" "The controlling shareholder agreement. I know what it is." "Do you?" He picked it up. He read. His face changed. He turned the page, then another. He looked at Margaret. "You can't use this." She said, "We're not using anything. We're following it." He looked at me. "You never told me." I said, "It was always available." He shook his head. "This isn't fair." I asked, "What isn't fair?" "You're changing the rules." "No." I looked at him. "You're finally reading them." The room went silent. Margaret continued. "Under the agreement, Robert Hayes retains controlling voting authority." Daniel said, "But I'm CEO." "Yes. So you can't remove me." Margaret turned another page. "I didn't say that." She placed a second document in front of him. Daniel read it. Then he stopped. He looked at me. His face had gone pale. "I want to slow down here because this is the moment everything changed. The first folder could be explained. The second could be disputed. But the third folder contained records that didn't care about Daniel's explanations. Bank records don't get embarrassed. Ownership records don't get emotional. Emails don't suddenly forget what they said because the person reading them is your son. And I knew that once Margaret opened that folder, there would be no way to put the old version of our family back together. That was the price of truth. It doesn't ask whether you're ready. It simply arrives. Margaret explained the clause. The controlling shareholder could remove the CEO under specific circumstances. One of those circumstances involved undisclosed financial conflicts. Daniel immediately said, "There is no conflict." Margaret looked at me. I nodded. She opened the third folder, bank records, contract records, ownership documents, Dane Holdings. The room changed. Daniel's voice became quiet. "Where did you get those?" I answered. "From our accounting department." He looked at the CFO. The CFO wouldn't meet his eyes. Daniel stood. "This is a misunderstanding," I said. "Then explain it." He couldn't. He tried. He said Dane Holdings was legitimate. He said the contracts were competitive. He said he had disclosed everything. Margaret placed an email on the table. "Then why did you instruct your assistant to remove the ownership disclosure from the board packet?" Daniel stared at it. Nobody moved. I said, "Daniel." He looked at me. "Tell them." He whispered, "Dad, please." That one word changed the room, not because it was powerful, because it wasn't. The man who had told me I was too old was now asking his father for help. I wanted to help him, but I couldn't protect him from what he had chosen. I said, "You had months to tell the truth." He looked down. I continued, "You had yesterday." He said nothing. I turned toward Margaret. "Read the resolution." She did. And when she reached the final line, Daniel was no longer CEO. Chapter 8, "You're fired." The moment after the decision, people often imagine revenge as a celebration. They imagine applause. They imagine someone smiling while another person suffers. Real consequences rarely feel like that. When Margaret finished reading the resolution, nobody clapped. Daniel didn't shout. I didn't smile. For a few seconds, I couldn't even look at him, because the man standing in front of me wasn't just my former CEO. He was the little boy who had once asked me whether he could have my chair when he grew up. That memory made the decision harder. It did not make the decision wrong, and there was still one question I needed answered. Why had he done it? Daniel remained standing. Vengeful Patriarch, page 20. Nobody spoke. Finally, he looked at me. "You're really doing this?" I said. "You asked me to leave." That was different. "No." He shook his head. "You're my father." I nodded. "And you're my son." He looked confused. "Then why?" I answered, "Because if I make an exception for you, I'm betraying everyone who trusted me to protect this company." He sat down. His shoulders dropped. The meeting continued. "The CFO asked what would happen next," I said. "We follow the law. We review every contract. We protect the employees. We stabilize the business." Nobody celebrated. There was no applause. This wasn't a victory party. It was a family tragedy happening inside a boardroom. But I had one final question. I looked at Daniel. "Why?" Vengeful Patriarch, page 21, he didn't answer. "Why did you need those companies?" He stared at the table. Finally, he said, "Because I wanted something that was mine." I said, "You could have built something." I didn't want to wait. That was the truth. He didn't want to build. He wanted to inherit. There is a difference. Chapter 9. The cost, the consequence I didn't expect, losing the title, was only the first consequence. The investigation forced Daniel to face something much more painful. People could no longer separate the man from the choices he had made. Employees talked. Directors asked questions. People who had once laughed with him stopped returning his calls. But the hardest consequence wasn't professional. It was personal. He had spent years trying to prove he could stand without his father's shadow. And in trying to escape that shadow, he had destroyed the trust that would have allowed me to stand beside him. 6 months later, when he came to my porch, I realized the story wasn't finished. The boardroom had ended. The father and son story had not. The investigation lasted months. Some contracts were cancelled. Some were renegotiated. The company recovered. Daniel did not. He lost his position. He lost the trust of the board. He lost relationships with people who had believed in him. And he lost something he didn't realize he valued until it was gone, his father's trust. Came to my house 6 months later. He stood on the porch. I opened the door. "Come in." He walked inside. We sat at the kitchen table. Vengeful Patriarch, page 20-2, the same kitchen where he had eaten birthday cake as a child. The same table where he had once told me he wanted to run the company. He looked older, not physically, emotionally. He said, "Do you hate me?" "No." "Why not?" "Because you're my son." He looked down. "I thought you wanted me to fail." I shook my head. "I wanted you to learn." He started crying. "I thought you were never going to let me be my own man." I said, "I was trying to." He looked up. "What do you mean?" "You didn't need my company to become your own man." He was silent. "You needed to build something yourself." He nodded. I told him, "If you want another chance, build it." He asked, "Will you help me?" I said, "I'll give you advice." He smiled sadly. "That's all." I nodded. "That's all." He understood. That was the first real adult conversation we'd had in years. A year can change a company, can change a career. Sometimes, if you're lucky, it can change a person. When I returned to Hayes Industrial, I expected to feel victorious. I didn't. I felt older, not weaker, just older, and there is a difference. I'd learned that legacy isn't the building, the revenue, the title, or the chair. Legacy is what remains after you stop sitting in the chair. That was the lesson Daniel had to learn too. And his first real test came when he called me with news about his own company. A year after the boardroom incident, I visited the company. I didn't have an office. I didn't need one. The new CEO was doing an excellent job. The company was growing. Employees were happier, and the board had created a much stronger succession plan. I walked past the old conference room. I stopped. I remembered Daniel standing there. "Dad, you're too old for this." At the time, those words had felt like an insult. Now I understood something. Age had nothing to do with what happened. The real issue was entitlement. Daniel believed that because he was my son, my life's work belonged to him. It didn't. I built it. I protected it. And eventually I had to protect it from him. But here's the part I want you to remember. Revenge isn't always about making someone suffer. Sometimes revenge is simply refusing to surrender your dignity. Sometimes it's walking away from an argument because you know the truth will speak for itself. Sometimes it's allowing someone to make their own choices and then refusing to rescue them from the consequences. Daniel eventually started a small company. No family money, no inherited title, no guaranteed customers. He started with 3 employees. He called me one evening. "Dad?" "Yes?" "I got my first major contract." I smiled. "Congratulations," he laughed. "It's not like Hayes Industrial." I said, "Good." He was quiet. Then he said, "I think I finally understand." "Understand what?" "That you weren't trying to keep the company from me." I waited. "You were trying to teach me how to deserve one." I smiled. "Maybe." We talked for another 20 minutes. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And sometimes honesty is the beginning of repairing something that pride destroyed. By the end of this story, you may be wondering whether I regret firing my son. The honest answer is complicated. I regret that it became necessary. I do not regret protecting the company, and I do not regret making Daniel face the consequences of his own decisions. Because there is a difference between punishment and consequence. Punishment says, "I want you to hurt." Consequence says, "I will no longer protect you from the choices you made." That difference changed both of us. Final message: my son told me I was too old to run his company. He was right about one thing: I was getting older. But getting older doesn't mean becoming powerless. It means you've had more time to learn, more time to see patterns, more time to understand people, more time to recognize the difference between confidence and arrogance. Daniel thought the boardroom was his. He thought the company was his. He thought I was an obstacle. What he didn't understand was that I wasn't fighting for a chair. I was protecting a legacy. And when he crossed the line, I did what a patriarch sometimes has to do. I stopped protecting my child from the consequences of his own choices. I fired my son, not because I stopped loving him, because I loved him enough to finally let him stand on his own. And maybe that was the hardest decision I ever made: not building the company, not surviving the difficult years, not signing the papers that removed him. The hardest part was realizing that sometimes the person you spent your entire life preparing to inherit your legacy is the very person you have to teach what that legacy actually means. If you've ever been told you're too old, too slow, or too irrelevant, remember this: someone else's impatience does not determine your worth, and someone else's attempt to take your power doesn't mean you have lost it. Sometimes the person who looks weakest in the room is the person who has already survived everything the room is afraid of. CTA, if this story stayed with you, I want to ask you something. Was Robert right to fire his own son? Or should a father always give his child one more chance, even when the company, the employees, and the truth are at stake? Tell me your honest opinion in the comments. Don't just write yes or no. Tell me what you would have done if you were Robert. I read those opinions because the most interesting part of these stories isn't only what the characters do, it's what we would do when the same choice is sitting in front of us. And if you enjoyed this story, take 1 second to like the video. A like tells YouTube that this kind of family betrayal and consequence story is worth recommending to more people who enjoy this genre. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to Vengeful Patriarch, because the next story begins with another father standing outside a house he helped pay for, after his own son tells him to leave. And the son has no idea that the father kept one document that could change who actually controls that house. Watch my son told me to leave his house after I paid his mortgage for 12 years, so I took it back. Because sometimes the person standing outside the door is the one holding the key. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for listening to Robert's story. And thank you for being part of Vengeful Patriarch. Until the next story, remember, never underestimate the man who built the table you're sitting at. The next story is about another father whose own son made a very different mistake. He paid his son's mortgage for 12 years. Then one night his son told him to get out of the house. What the son didn't know was that the father had kept the one document that could take the entire house back. Watch. My son told me to leave his house after I paid his mortgage for 12 years, so I took it back. Because sometimes the person standing outside the door is the one who owns the key.